Tenemos un nuevo episodio de Disco en Disco y en esta ocasión nos acompaña Jack Tatum, la mente maestra detrás de Wild Nothing, quien aprovechó su regreso a México para darse una vuelta en Discópolis y platicarnos de los artistas y discos que han inspirado su proyecto musical. Este es nuestro primer episodio en inglés y sí, aunque yo sé que hablo como la morra de María Guadalupe, lo importante es que Jack me entendió y que el video tendrá subtítulos para que no se nos confundan. Jack, thank you so much for your time, and today you're coming back to Mexico to promote your album Whole that you released last year. And I understand that album, you made it when we were in the pandemic, and in a time when you became a father, so it was a really big step for you, like in your personal life. But I wanted to know if do you hear some artist or some specific album when you were making this record?
Yeah, there was definitely some things that I feel like I was pulling from pretty directly. I went through a big phase of like going pretty deep on like Peter Gabriel's discography. And actually, this is another band that I really love, Tears for Fears. This is a great record too. But yeah, you know, I've always had a lot of love for, it's kind of like, I guess you could say pop bands in the 80s, but people like Tears for Fears that I think were doing something a bit more interesting. You know, it was like pop music, and it was kind of music for everybody. They I think really wanted to be big bands, but the songwriting was still really good, and you know, I think like production-wise, they were doing a lot of things like trying to push new boundaries at the time. But yeah, you know, it's like I love 80s music. It's obviously my favorite decade. I've kind of been like pulling from a lot of 80s bands my whole career. But yeah, I mean, it was an interesting time working on that record. I think just because of the pandemic and like having a new kid, it was like it kind of like became this real small experience again of just being me, like working in my home studio, writing songs. So it was fun in a way because it kind of reminded me of when I made my first record. Because when I made my first record, I pretty much did everything myself. So it felt like that a little bit again.
You mentioned your first album, Gemini, that I think was released 14 years ago. And I understand that when you released that record, you were still a student of journalism. Is that right? Yeah. That's what I studied in college. So it was kind of like, you know, I think at the time I wanted to write about music, or that's kind of what I thought maybe I wanted to do. And I ended up switching and studying more film and film history. But yeah, it wasn't really until basically when my first record came out that I even thought that I could do music, you know, professionally. It didn't really occur to me that was a reality. Do you have any like record that you remember that you listened a lot when you were in college?
I'm trying to think. I mean, well, definitely, like, you know, like a band like The Cure or something was really huge to me. And I always liked The Cure, you know, even when I was a kid or a teenager. But I think when I was in college and trying to kind of like revisit some of these bands like The Cure, The Smiths, like these bands that are like everybody knows them, but just trying to kind of like dissect the way they made music. And yeah, that first record that I made when I was in college, it was very much me, like, trying to do the sound of all the bands that I loved, you know, which I think is how a lot of musicians start. They start by kind of emulating or copying the bands that they really love. Yeah, and I mean, and like, you know, like Roxy Music too was like another huge band for me.
Why?
Well, I think... So I'm a huge Brian Eno fan too, and so I think initially I was intrigued by kind of like the time that Brian Eno spent in Roxy Music in the beginning. And I don't know, they had a really cool sort of progression as a band, where in the beginning there was, you know, a bit stranger, a bit more kind of like art rock, and then I think as they progressed, you know, it like the production got really smooth and really like hi-fi. I don't know, I liked that progression, sort of like seeing where the band went over the course of, you know, 4 or 5 records.
And we know that While Nothing is like a project very influenced by 80s music.
Yeah.
But how do you discover that music? Do you remember when was the first song or record that you listened to?
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely stuff in the house growing up with my parents. You know, they... so actually my aunt and uncle lived in Athens, Georgia in the 80s, kind of like at the height of when REM was getting started, and you had the B-52s. And so my parents, you know, kind of were into a lot of that stuff too. So around the house growing up, it's like B-52s, REM.
Also, there's a cover that you did many years ago, and I really love it. The Kate Bush cover.
Yeah.
And what do you think about covers? Because I think many artists are not too much into covers, but others just like giving them like their own essence.
You know, it's funny because I feel like at this point in my career, I'd maybe be a little bit more scared to do a cover because it feels like a lot of pressure. I always feel like if a band covers something, it's like if you don't do something interesting with it, or if you don't almost make it better, then it's like, what's the point, sort of. But I don't know, like when I did that Kate Bush cover, I was just so young, and it was just, I just loved that song, and I just wanted to like record my own version of it. I didn't really expect anyone to hear it. You know, it wasn't even until I just kind of like put it out on the internet, because this was, you know, back when like blogs were so important, and it just kind of got picked up and people were sending it around. It was like this very like organic thing, which was cool, but it sort of was like, whoa, like I don't know, I didn't expect like that many people to hear it. And then of course I ended up getting it released like as a B-side of a 7-inch.
Did ever Kate Bush hear that cover?
I don't know. If she has, I haven't heard anything about it, but yeah.
Because you mentioned that you wanted to study journalism because to be involved in music some way, and I think music journalists we do that all the time just to get to know our favorite bands.
Yeah.
But there was any artist or record that made you make the decision of, maybe I want to do music instead of just being a journalist?
There was always like more contemporary stuff that I was into at the same time. So when I was in college, or like in high school even, really, I was a really big fan of Phil Elverum, who has a project called The Microphones in Mount Erie. I think what attracted me to his music was that it felt very... like it felt within reach. It was kind of a little rough around the edges, kind of more like home recorded sounding music. And I think hearing a lot of, and you know, when I first started the band, there was a lot of people that were kind of doing the like DIY, like home recorded stuff. And so I felt like, oh, I can do this too. You know, it doesn't have to be something that's I'm spending a ton of money on. It's funny actually that there's like some Fleetwood Mac records laying around, because this record in particular is like a huge record for me. And another record that, like when I was in college, so to explain, I went to college in this town called Blacksburg, Virginia. It's a really small town. There wasn't really any like record stores, and so if I wanted to buy records, one of the only places I could find them was to go to like antique stores. Or just like weird stuff like that. And so I would only be able to find like these kinds of records, you know, like really big records that just people like didn't want anymore. But like I love this record, and you know, like Fleetwood Mac is kind of like on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where it's like these records, you know, like cost so much money to make, and it felt like this very sort of like far away thing. They're like, oh, I could never make a record sound like this perfect or something.
Do you have any
Yeah.
history behind those records?
Yeah, so it was this one, and then Fleetwood Mac had another record called Mirage. And I remember too, when I was in college, I was also collecting a lot of cassette tapes, because it was like a similar thing where at antique stores or thrift stores, you could find tons of cassette tapes for so cheap. And it's like, I didn't have a lot of money, so I was like buying a bunch of cassette tapes. And my car at the time had a cassette player, and one of the only tapes, like few tapes that I had, were like some of these Fleetwood Mac tapes. And so I would just listen to them over and over again. Every time I was driving, I was just like, because those were the only tapes in my car. And I feel like it was a kind of a thing where like it started with me not liking it all that much, and then by the time, you know, I'd been driving in my car for like a year listening to these tapes, I was like in love with it.
You also talk about your love for movies. Mm-hmm. And I know that you have a lot of references of movies in your songs. Like, I think only Heather from Nocturne has this reference from Heather's movie.
Yes, you're not the first person to say that. Yeah, no, not necessarily, but yeah, I could see that. But yeah, there have been some other ones. I mean, there's a song on Nocturne called Rhea, which is the last song on the record, that like references Solaris, like the sci-fi movie. And then, yeah, some other ones, like there's a song on Indigo called Bend that was inspired by Wings of Desire, just like a Wim Wenders movie. Yeah, I've always there's always been this parallel for me with music and movies, and especially too, just the way that music can be used in movies to really enhance the experience of a movie. It can be so important sometimes to sort of like whether a movie is successful or not because of how music is used.
What would you say is your favorite movie score?
I don't know that I have one in particular, but I definitely went through a big phase of getting really into a lot of like old Italian soundtracks. Like Ennio Morricone is like the best to ever do it. So I definitely have a lot of Ennio Morricone scores on record. Yeah. Well, here's another record that I love. This Air record. I feel like I've been thinking about this a little bit recently because I don't know if it's just getting older because of me like having kids, but I feel like I've been kind of like going back and like re-listening to a lot of things, especially from when I was a teenager. And it's been funny to me seeing what records I was really into as a teenager that I can put on and I love, and other records that I was obsessed with as a teenager that I put on and it's kind of like, I don't know, like I don't connect with this anymore. But I feel like Air is one of these bands where I can still go back and listen to Moon Safari and like Talkie-Walkie, and they still sound like as good, if not better than they did.
How did you discover them?
I mean, I think when I was a teenager, I was much more interested in sort of like what was happening, like in the moment. I was less sort of like looking backwards, and I was kind of all about like new music and, you know, like looking at blogs and looking at Pitchfork and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I think probably when I was in high school, the record Talkie-Walkie came out, and I was like, oh, I really like this. And then I went back and like was listening to Moon Safari. But yeah, I think too, this record is kind of like a perfect blend of like having a lot of these kind of like easy listening, like 60s references, but also like electronic leaning, like electronica kind of thing. Yeah, so this is like a record that I still listen to quite a lot, actually.
You said something really interesting about listening again to records that has many years ago, and just find that familiarity about them. Did that happen to you with your records? Because I know Gemini and Nocturne and Life of Pause, they are really different each other. True, you have the Wild Nothing essence on them, but they are really different. Do you have any kind of similar feeling when you hear, I don't know, Gemini again?
Yeah, I think so. And it's always when we're putting a tour together, and it kind of like forces me to go back and re-listen to records that I've made, and kind of, I don't know, I've realized that I have very different relationships with all of these records, because for me it's like, it's not just a record, it's like it immediately takes me back to a very particular time in my life. So it's like, you know, I start thinking, oh, these are the people that I was around, this is where I was. Yeah, and I've talked about this before, but I feel like it's a lucky thing, and it's a rare thing to have these, to be in the position of having records that like point back to certain parts of my life and have it be like very public. It's weird. Well, I noticed too, I mean, this is like obviously such a classic record, but I feel like I went through a really huge Talking Heads phase around the time that I was making my third record. So maybe like 2016. And this is my favorite Talking Heads record, like by a mile. I think it's the best one. I feel like this is another kind of band, not that they really share anything in common with Fleetwood Mac, but another band where like I would occasionally be able to find, you know, like a Talking Heads record at a like a flea market or an antique store or something, and being in a really small town where there wasn't really like any like great record store, to be able to have access to sort of like records like this that I could just find at a thrift store or whatever is like really awesome to me. And so like Talking Heads became like such a huge band for me because of that. And yeah, again, it's like the Brian Eno connection, and I've always been a huge David Byrne fan. And there's some I mean, I think a lot of people too have kind of an idea of what they think the Talking Heads are, and then, you know, you can listen to a record like this and there's so much variety, and like some of the songs are really strange, like, you know, like they were a very experimental band. Yeah, it's such a good record, really, like just like such a good grooves, and yeah, it's amazing. I just noticed this too. This is pretty cool to see. I got really obsessed with this record when I was in college because it was like all things The Cure I loved, and so when I found out that there was this kind of like, oh, do you know about The Glove? It's like this Robert Smith side project. It was like at the time to me it was kind of like, oh, like I found this sort of like hidden secret thing. But this record is really awesome. I love this song, Like an Animal. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of good songs on this record. Punish Me with Kisses, that's a cool one.
De verdad que me encanta cómo los artistas tienen un ecosistema musical detrás de sus proyectos. Y en el caso de Wild Nothing fue muy cool no solo saber que The Cure, Air y Fleetwood Mac han influenciado a Jack Tatum, sino también ver cómo los artistas emergentes conocen y se identifican con la música de otros proyectos. ¿O ustedes qué opinan? Nos vemos en el siguiente episodio. Bye.